Hello. So on your screen is Dr. Varun Nagaraj, the newly minted Dean of SPJIMR. I'll introduce him a little briefly. Of course, before that, let me also tell you that when I first spoke to him about 4 or 5 days ago about the show, he mentioned a coincidence. He said that this is the 169th show of prime time, which includes exclusives and all of that. And he was in room number 169 at IIT Bombay. So I'll come to that with a question. So who's this, Srishti? Oh,
That's Varun's
169 with
room
his
number.
children.
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't know this. You're going to spring this on both of us. So she's pulled it out from somewhere. Anyway, so I'll first do an introduction and then come back to this IIT Bombay data. So, Dr. Varun Nagaraj, IIT Bombay, he went abroad. He did his MS there, I think, Case University, right? And
So
then
my MS was in North Carolina State. My
North
PhD was
Carolina
in
State.
Case.
Okay. And your PhD was in Case. Okay. And then he's worked at several, industrial IoT companies. He did his own startup. He was a CEO, and then he did a, fair amount of time visiting faculty, during which time I think he did his PhD, and then decided to do this academics thing. Now he's been on the Forbes Business Council. He's been nominated to that. He's written a book. I hear. I kind of picked that up. I'll come to a question on that. He's written quite a bit of stuff on some magazines that I again, the Information Week, somewhere 1995. I'll again ask about it a little later. And he now is in a very dispersed, distributed family. Wife is a principal, running an NGO school in Dehradun. Two children in the U.S., Houston, Texas. Both, one in academics, one in working, and he's here in Bombay. So with that introduction, Dr. Nagaraj, let me dive into the first question. 169th episode, 169 room number. Tell us some of your life learnings at IIT Bombay. And while you do that, also name some of the other stars from your batch.
Sure thing. Sure thing. So let's talk about life learnings, right? Most of the learnings at IIT, most people will tell you, happened around the the bathrooms of the wings late at night after 8 o'clock until about 1 or 2 in the morning, right? That was basically the place where you congregated, to share philosophical ideas, argue with each other, and so on. The thing that it did that I thought was unique about IIT was the I mean, you had obviously strong-willed, smart folks, but they came from so many different backgrounds, and they had so many different opinions, and so you got very comfortable disagreeing with people. You got very comfortable arguing with people, and you got very comfortable, not having to listen to the same thing that you were thinking of, right? One of the challenges in today's world is people go into their silos, and social media has made it worse. You can surround yourself totally with a group of people that think exactly like you, and then all kinds of interesting debate and discourse gets lost because you're in an echo chamber surrounded by similar people. And while you would think IIT would consist of similar people, it didn't. It really consisted of people with so many different opinions, all of who were confident, argumentative people. And so you learn to basically argue, and you learn to basically accept differences. You learn to insult each other in the nicest possible way, sort of like British Parliament to some degree, right? Maybe a little cruder than that. But I thought what it created really was a very open-minded set of people who were always open to new ideas, who were always open to the fact that there were people smarter than them that could, on any given point, disprove them, on any given point, beat them. But there might be another point on which you could beat that person, right? So I think it created, a very intellectually egalitarian sort of way of looking at the world. So that was one, I think, unique advantage that I haven't actually seen many of my other friends, no matter what institutes they went to, including the finest in the US, claim that particular capability, right, of making them more broad-minded in that fashion. The second thing I think IIT taught taught you was really this concept of having fundas, right? And I wanted to sort of get into the notion of what exactly is having a funda, right? And some people equate fundas with gyan, and I don't think they're the same thing. Gyan is a specific piece of knowledge that, person A gives person B. And sometimes you could think of fundas as being similar, but they're really not. To me, a funda basically is the ability to look at an unfamiliar situation and figure out the answer, right? So the true funda man, unfortunately, we use the phrase funda man. I'll call them funda persons, funda people, right? Not being sexist, but to use the phrase back from then, the funda man was someone who'd be confronted with a problem, right, that they had never seen before. And they would be able to figure that particular problem out, as opposed to the maggus who had a pattern recognition that they had developed, like all this quota factory stuff, right? That's not teaching you fundas, that's teaching you pattern recognition, right? You're working on 1,000 problems, that one looks exactly like this, and you basically inductively derive the solution to the 1,001st problem. But a funda basically means you understand the underlying principles beneath it so well that even though you're confronted with a problem you have never seen before in your life, you're able to figure it out. Now, why is that important? I think the world we live in, KG, today is going to be throwing problems at us that we haven't seen before. And it's not just in terms of there are new technologies and new tools and so on. I just think fundamentally, like COVID being an example, we are going to get confronted with situations we haven't seen before at all. Now, the question is, how does one deal with this kind of an information, right? How does one deal with a world that is just strange and unfamiliar? First part of it is to be open-minded, right, as to what it is that is going on around you, which is why that first skill set from IIT is the one I mentioned first, right? Being able to absorb information from all sides, because who the heck knows? Somebody else might know better, right? The second part is being able to sort of say problem solving is really about fundas, meaning understanding what might be going on, deconstructing it to sort of the core bits, and then trying to figure out a solution. Now, what does it take to be a funda man? Some people just knew and were funda men, and some people were not, right? But now, in my 50s, as I think about it, I do think there are certain fundamental tools and fundamental approaches that anybody can apply in order to try and be a more funda man than they used to be, right? And these kinds of tools, if you think about it, are the ability to do systems thinking, right? Thinking about the world in all its interconnected pieces, understanding the feedback loops between them, understanding that effects are nonlinear, understanding that there are sudden tipping points. That is sort of one of the toolkits that I think makes you into a slightly more funda man. I'm not going to claim by any means I know what makes it. Some people just had it. But I think that notion, those two notions are what I think IIT gave me, the ability to be open-minded and humble in terms of recognizing that anybody could beat you on any day and they might have something that you don't have. And two, having sort of a funda way of sort of looking at problems not as a pattern matching, but in a more fundamental way, right? Hence that phrase. So that was that. Now my classmates have done extremely well, as have to your second part of the question. So for example, one of my friends said I was actually starting to work on a new startup just before, and I was deciding whether to take that to completion or to come to SPJMR. And I decided to come to SPJMR, but to give you, his name is Vibhu Mittal, and he was employee number 8 or 9 at Google. And he's a Google fellow, right? And Google Translate, he wrote that. Google Scholar or scholar.google.com, he did that. Now, this was in the days of Google where their point was no matter what the product is, you don't need more than 3 people to build it, right? So Google Translate, right? Today we would think, oh, it's a 5,000 person team, throw bodies and this and that, 3 people. You take a look at Google News, 3 people, right? So Vibhu was one of those 3 people. He's a PhD from University of Southern California, and he was at IIT in computer science with me. So he, I think, would be an example of a truly funda man that I think has achieved remarkable things. In academia, I have an amazing friend who is, I think, one of the best academics in environmental science and policy. So he does electrical engineering with me and then goes and does his PhD in environmental policy, right? Just because, he can, right? So I'd sort of say he's another, remarkable person from my class that has done extremely well. I have another friend who will soon get announced as a director of a very major institution. In fact, the CEO of Infosys, Salil Parekh, was my classmate as well.
Wow.
So I think we've had a good group of folks that have all done well in their lives, and I'd like to think that these two things I talked to you about as being sort of key to IIT, perhaps helped them as it did me.
Super, super. So many things I had to make notes. I mean, you actually kind of described Rancho in a manner of speak. If you saw Three Idiots, did you see Three Idiots?
I did see Three Idiots,
So
yes.
Rancho is that fundament, right? So I mean, you kind of brought out that fundament, and yeah, folks listening in, please. Three people did Google Translate. Three people did
Yes,
whatever else.
your people are going to hate me when they say we don't have resources and I need more people and all. Tell them three people wrote Google Translate.
Three people wrote, yeah, an ability to do system thinking. Later on, if I do remember, I mean, you at some stage mentioned about, what is that called? Analysis versus synthesis, right? Somewhere, one of your videos I saw. I think systems thinking is probably there. Anyway, since you mentioned in your answer that you were considering something else, and that something else, I mean, you spoke about as probably a tool that attacks fake news or something like that. Can you talk about it?
Sure, sure. So I think I'll talk about the problem statement or the area that we were trying to solve. And here's why it is such an iterative approach to figuring out how best do you want to solve a big problem, right? Because you cannot obviously come up with one mega solution. So, for example, if you look at the problem of fake news and you look at how easily fake news spreads, the question is, well, what can you do about it, right? There are so many things, that are being proposed, that are being tried, not just by the big platforms, but by others. So, for example, when we eat food or we drink any particular beverage, there's a nutrition label now, right, that is attached to that, food container, right? That tells you how many calories it has, how much protein, sugars, and so on and so forth. So there is this notion of having an information label on a piece of news. Now, what might an information label be, and how would one create an information label, and who creates an information label, right? Now, there's pieces of news that are temporal, they come and go. Somebody wrote something, and then there are things like the Wikipedia pages and others that will stay for a while, right? That are there, that are citable, that are referenceable, that are going to be there for some period of time. So the concept of an information label could very well be about, identifying the credibility of the author, identifying the provenance, meaning where does this come from, right? What are all the pieces of news that lead up to this particular claim? So you can essentially take any piece of information and create an information label that tells you where did this come from and who is the author and what is the credibility of this person. And that credibility, how do you figure it out? It could be crowdsourced, meaning, right, like in Wikipedia, for example, there's an automatic way of credibility in terms of how many previous articles has somebody written. So citation count is an interesting way of creating credibility. So basically, one approach to sort of putting some authenticity on information is the notion of an information label, right? Now, there are obviously plenty of other ways in which one could, do that. For example, let us say, one of the worst offenders for spreading fake news is WhatsApp, right? I know everybody picks on Facebook for, the Facebook platform, but think about it. All it takes is a forward to take an utter piece of garbage and send it from your WhatsApp feed to somebody else's feed, right? And you'll see how many times things have been sent. And most of the times, people who are sending stuff, if you ask them, why do you think this is true? They don't really have a good answer, right? It just showed up on their WhatsApp feed. Should you believe it? Should you not? Well, if it was sent to you by a friend that you normally trust, maybe you believe it. But, what if he got it from some other piece of garbage, right? So this whole notion of, imagine, therefore, in an interesting world, if as you're basically looking to forward a piece of WhatsApp news, an article, right? And there's so much fake stuff out there, 10 ways in which Einstein, got all his ideas from the Bhagavad Gita, right? There could be an article like that. And somebody will say, see, I told you, all the knowledge in the world is contained in the Bhagavad Gita. Even Einstein got his ideas from there. How do you validate that, right? Before you send it on, is there some way within the WhatsApp structure for going and checking on the provenance? Where did this come from, right? And so the information label equivalent slapped onto pieces of information that are being forwarded could be an interesting way to do it. Now, all of these are interesting little technology ideas, but how do you put it together in a way that it actually, is part of a system, right? So that's what my friends and I were sort of working on. Obviously, the whole ocean is a huge ocean to boil. So
Yes.
we were looking for narrow pieces of stuff. For example, information that is interesting, tends to be looked at. So if you're trying to educate somebody on something, making information fun and interesting is one way to do it. So in a sense, it's not directly tied into truth and veracity and misinformation, but it is tied to the way in which people consume information, right? And what sources do they then trust and so forth. So we were looking at sort of interesting ways of essentially having people engage with information in a more live fashion as opposed to as passive consumers, which is what we have. And there's probably 100 great ways of doing it. And I'm sure my friend Vibhu and another friend Balraj, who built two great companies that he sold to Juniper Networks and so on. And the three of us were working on this along with a very famous Silicon Valley American guy, whose name I can't mention. But I think this company idea, will probably solve some piece of the problem. Not all of it, but if there are 100 such companies trying to solve this problem, I think it's worth it because I do think misinformation is probably the single largest threat that's facing human civilization today.
Yeah. Super. Uh, okay. In our talk before this, you had also mentioned this that you had in your avatar of a CEO or COO, etc., worked with Indian IT vendors, and you actually named a company also, and you worked in the area of engineering services.
That's
So,
right.
what are some of the best practices you can share for people listening in? Because we are also an IT services company. We have an engineering unit that also pitches to a lot of similar
Right.
startups, etc. So, what are the best practices you think our leaders can learn from a user? I mean, you are a business side, owner, user,
Smart.
and,
Yeah.
and how should they adapt, and seek help and pitch, etc.
Yeah. So so I think the thing I've noticed, or I noticed through the years, is a lot of services companies have building blocks, right, that they bring in as they call it accelerators, they call it technology enablers and so forth as a way of sort of getting a project off the ground faster. And I think that's a really good thing to do. But sometimes you can get, what ends up happening when you have an enabler, as they say, right, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Nail.
Right. And I think that is a slight danger when you have these building blocks or enablers because you're looking to apply these enablers, rightly so, for good business reason. But it then takes your mind away from the actual problem statement. So the thing I liked about this one company that we worked with was, it started off as a regular engagement. We drew out the, what it is we wanted. We sort of drew out what today would be the Figmas or the InVisions or the sketches, the UIs. What we were trying to do was basically take old school industrial products, like maybe a fire panel, maybe a gas monitoring solution, building automation, and so forth. Things that would have generally been standalone. And we were essentially converting them into smart connected products or to IoT connected products. This is back in 2014, 2015, when the idea was not 100% penetrated yet. So in that particular situation, the solution we were building obviously had an embedded component that would go inside the mechanical device. And we were providing sort of a modules, if you will, that would go into such devices. We were building out a new cloud platform that would connect automatically over different kinds of networks, to these devices. Obviously, these things had to be provisioned at scale and provisioned easily because you're looking at large networks. You had to come up with some early versions back then of predictive maintenance and alarms, right? How do you basically minimize the amount of traffic that's coming, because these were coming over relatively narrow pipes, if you will, on the cellular world, and the data plans might have been expensive, so it's not something you're continuously streaming. So there's a logic to how you basically look at the data and how often you need this kind of data. Then there was this notion of, well, once you have the data, how do you know if something is normal or abnormal? What are you benchmarking against? So there's a whole early concept of machine learning, or an early concept of anomaly detection, if you will, that would tell you if there was an issue or not, right? So that was kind of the scope of the kinds of products we were looking at. So this particular vendor what impressed me in the beginning, they were very traditional, as in, they waited for us to give them a requirements document, right? And so it's very much around, here's a spec, here's a requirements document, they bid so many hours, so many people, we have progress updates, MOMs, and all those kinds of good things. But I needed more. I needed innovation from them, as in I wanted them to think of themselves as part of my team, not reacting to me, but basically helping me innovate. And so I made a trip over to India to actually go work in their facility for a week, 2 weeks, because I figured, the relationship might be a lot easier if we had actually sat in a room and worked as colleagues. Otherwise, there was too much of a hierarchy, right? I am the client, and on top of that, I'm the CEO of the company. I just happen to be interested in products. That's why I'm sitting there, right? Um, and the services organization is basically treating me very well and respectfully and everything, but not necessarily as an equal from an intellectual point of view. And as you know from my IIT days, that's kind of what I'm used to, right? Push me, challenge me, right? But now what happened was 10 days of being in the same room together, I began to see a nice transformation amongst some of the staff, right? They began to get up to the whiteboard, right? And they sort of said, I don't know what they called me, whether it was Varun or whatever, but I know, Varun, but here are some alternate ways of doing it. Now, what it forced them to do was to defend their position, right? And the position couldn't be defended by saying, I have an accelerator or a block that does this. The position could be defended by pointing to competitive alternatives. It could be, the position could be defended by actually trying to understand customer user needs. So, and now, mind you, these folks, of course, don't know my end users quite yet, right? Because my end users are my business at this point. But what they did, the smart guys, what they did was they went in and found other examples within their company, either in the same domain or different domains, and they pulled together customer requirements from those, right? And sort of said, okay, here's a customer requirement that seems somewhat similar to what you have. Here's how we sort of did it. Or they said, we looked at a competitor of yours, and I was very impressed when they proactively began to look at my competitors, right? And I didn't tell them to go look at that. They went and looked at a competitor and said, here's how this competitor seems to be doing this particular solution. Maybe there's something here that we could do. So that warmed my heart, because it meant that now these guys had stepped up from being people reacting to my spec and reacting to me as a client to actually, brainstorming with me, but bringing sort of their knowledge, not waiting for me to tell them stuff. So that to me was an interesting and a good experience working with MKG. And I'll philosophize a little bit. I think this kind of collaboration requires a equal and egalitarian and confident two-way relationship. And I think sometimes, the nature of client services is such that it's not always easy to do that, right? Sometimes, there is a implied power structure, there is an implied, accountability part, which turns it much more into a reporting type of relationship than this kind of a collaborative give and take relationship. The other part, and I may be going out on a limb here, and you might call me being too American and not desi enough yet, though I'll get desi enough soon enough. And the part I'll go out on a limb is, the moment you have a structure where everybody is a sir or a ma'am, it makes me uncomfortable, because I think the moment it's meant to be respectful, I understand that. But I think the moment you address somebody as a sir, you have ceded authority to them. You have basically said, your decision making supersedes my decision making, or I am only empowered to do a certain amount, but beyond that, I need your approval. I need your, permission. And we all are empowered folks. And my approach is make your decisions, make mistakes, and ask for forgiveness later, as opposed to asking for permission, right? So I've always been a believer in asking for forgiveness. And my son, unfortunately, has taken it to an extreme level, as opposed to asking for permission. But to me, that also is just a mindset that contributes to innovation, right? I think very hierarchical, it is difficult to innovate. And I don't know to what extent the sir ma'am thing plays to that, but as a guy who's only been in India now, back from the States for a month or so, I'm wondering if that adds to the hierarchy and therefore gets in the way of innovation.
It's a first step. I mean, Shrishti is listening to me, and you sound very much. I'm sure she's thinking that you sound very much like me, asking for forgiveness rather than waiting for permission. All of that are some of my pet lines. So I mean, and this also happens. I also say is this, that especially in emerging markets, like Middle East and all that, your master services agreement, which is actually same, becomes very soon master slave agreement. So, then the whole thing starts, and people don't want to. They just, okay, you tell me what to do, etc. And we keep hearing this also from clients, thought leadership, that that hated, not hated phrase. People who are afraid of that thought leadership, and they scurry around what thought leadership is about. And the other thing is also that it requires the client facing person to be technically savvier. You cannot get by being only schmoozing and golf playing.
Yeah, I agree. That is totally.
Yeah. So that is also a problem, because somewhere in between. So, I saw an interview of yours on video where you were the Sierra Monitor SMC Corporation's CEO. And then you gave an example of how in a stadium you can do blah, blah, put it all together, and turnstiles and air conditioning and food and all of that can be all monitored in the control room on a limb. Are you planning to do something similar at SP Jain as an institute?
KG, we work on a lower budget than the 40. See, it's one thing to go to the San Francisco 49ers, which is the California's world champ, caliber American football team, and be able to pitch a solution that will automatically turn things on and off at various seats during the game. Another thing to be part of a non-profit educational institution trying to make it happen. So
now I'm going to that SP Jain is fairly profitable.
No, but we're still a non-profit.
Not in that. Sure. You also talk, and I think we also spoke about conscious capitalism and the need for moving to that. And I remember you saying that maybe you can pitch in with some 101 on capitalism itself concepts, and then move to conscious capitalism. Can you help us with that?
Sure. And I noticed we have about 70 people online, and guys, if I end up sounding professorial, that's okay. Just bear with me for a little bit. These are all things that honestly are, fantastic foundational, pieces of knowledge that I think that I wish we all were exposed to this kind of stuff. So we'll get to that in a second. But I ask for your indulgence if I sound like a professor. So let's start with kind of the notion of conscious capitalism and what is real and what is not. So let's start with sort of a cynical view, right? The cynical view, which unfortunately, KG, when you become 55, you always start with a cynical view, right? So the cynical view is that a lot of these environmental buzzwords are being used by corporations to do what's called greenwashing. What does greenwashing mean? Greenwashing basically means that you as a company use language like, oh, we're following a sustainability framework, we're doing corporate social responsibility, we have an ESG framework that allows us to look for our societal impact. They're all good things, nothing wrong with any of the words, but they tend to become sort of marketing methods of sort of couching your company in a desirable light for the consumer. And yes, lots of companies will take small steps towards, becoming better companies in that sense, right? So in that sense, they're conscious. But the amount of publicity they try and generate from it, or the amount of noise about it, far exceeds the reality of the small steps that they might be taking. So this is one thing to be aware of, right, when you're listening to companies and their pitch. A great example of this was, you're familiar with, the big brokerage platforms, online trading platforms, online brokerage, asset management, and so on. So a couple of the big ones are, like in the US, Vanguard Funds is a massive one, which also operates, worldwide. So these guys will, from time to time, create, index funds, right? They'll create an index fund or a mutual fund that, adheres to a certain philosophy. So a lot of these big companies created sort of a fund, or their respective funds, that were meant to track companies that they believe are exemplar companies, in terms of changing the world, in terms of, being conscious and being environmentally friendly and so forth. And pretty soon now, if you go and look at the top 10 holdings of these various funds, whether it's Vanguard, whether it's Fidelity, whatever, it consists of Google, Microsoft, Amazon. Okay, nothing wrong with these companies, but honestly, guys, is that the best you can do, that the 10 great companies in this world that are doing and leading change are those companies? And there are these other companies. And I'll give you one example. I don't know if it's one you use or not. It's an online marketplace, which was a niche marketplace called Etsy, Etsy. So Etsy.com is one that has done extremely well on the capital markets now. But when they started, this was authentic, right? What they basically said was, look, there are all these artisans in the world that all have the ability to be creative and to produce goods. There are people who want unique kinds of things, right? Not just the mainstream stuff you can go buy in Amazon and buy elsewhere. So, for example, maybe I want a Christmas tie, for my entire team, and the Christmas tie needs to show something or the other, right? It needs to show Santa Claus, but because we're living in a world of Black Lives Matter, I want the Santa Claus to be a dark-skinned person. Okay, so I'm looking for ties that have a dark-skinned Santa Claus on them. So now, where do I go find something like this, right? So what you ended up with on Etsy was sort of a two-sided marketplace of individual artisans who lived wherever they lived, creating these niche products that otherwise they would have never been able to sell. But what Etsy created was a platform that matched millions of these kinds of exotic small items with users that wanted something interesting to go buy, something different, right? So this basically brought them together. What it also allowed people to do was, like if you're an NGO, you could go to, let's say, Ecuador, and in Ecuador they were working with, alpaca as a form of llama, right? So it produces wool. So let's say these folks were knitting certain kinds of sweaters, right, based on alpaca wool, which is very, very, by the way, viewed very highly. It's superbly soft wool. It's like nothing you've worn. I have one alpaca sweater, which is amazing. But the point is, what patterns do Americans like, right? So the NGO basically began to show folks in Ecuador how to create products that basically could be bought by American customers, right? The collar needs to be of a certain type and so on and so forth. So what you had was an ecosystem of artisans and creative people developing products that the rest of the world wanted brought together, right? So to me, that is an interesting example. And this company is a multi-billion-dollar company now, and they have adhered to their basic rule that any decision they make, they look to see how does it benefit their community, right? Everything is looked at from the sense of the community. So these are the kinds of companies that, I would say are not greenwashing, that they truly are living this notion of, conscious capitalism, right? So I want to make that distinction because everybody and their brother is going to use that phrase claiming that's us. And my point simply is that, everybody has the right intentions, but not everybody can claim first place is all I'm going to say, right? Okay, so let's get back to sort of, well, what does it mean for you guys as individuals, to work in a world of conscious capitalism? What can you do as a marketing associate, a customer-facing person, or a human being in general, to make sure that capitalism works, for everybody, not just for a few people? That's really what we're trying to do. So I'll basically present two constructs to you guys, right? The first construct is that of the free market, and the second construct is that of justice or morality, right? Because the two are not necessarily the same. They complement each other. A lot of people will talk about the fact that, hey, I'm a free marketeer, right? I believe in free markets, as do I, by the way, right? I am in many ways, a libertarian, meaning I believe in individual liberty. I believe that rights should be symmetrical, meaning whatever rights I have, anybody else in society should have. That one person's rights should not impinge on another person's rights. That there should be property rights that demarcate, who owns what, right? And there should be division of labor, and therefore, prices get set according to the division of labor. Now, these are fundamental principles that Adam Smith, who was one of the early folks during a time of what was called the Scottish Enlightenment. This is the early dawn of capitalism. So you're looking hundreds of years ago, laid out, right? And this has served as kind of the building blocks of sort of what is called free market economics. And now and then even governments in India will claim that they're more free market than others. And, but I'm not going to get into the debate specific to this. But the principles of free market are actually quite simple. There are only 4 or 5 rules, right? But it includes individual liberty, and the fact that you have symmetrical rights and you can trade, right? You can basically exchange goods with each other. These are the blocks. Now, free markets generally often work. Now, free markets, some people, those with a much more socialist mindset, might dislike, what it produces. But before we get there, if you look at free markets are the world's most efficient allocation mechanism. What were the alternatives? It was the Soviet Union with its style of centralized planning. So the question really comes down to, if you're trying to say, here is a set of resources and they need to be divided in a certain way, work needs to be divided in a certain way, assets need to be divided in a certain way, who makes that decision? Is it the government that makes that decision through central planning, which is what the Soviet approach was? Or does the so-called invisible hand of the market magically arrive at the right answer because of the free market economics with these few rules in place, right? And I believe that you're better off trusting the free market than you are, heavy-handed government. But that said, free markets fail all the time, right? Free markets don't always produce, even the efficient outcomes. So I'm not going to talk yet about the moral outcomes or the just or the right outcomes. I'm just going to talk about efficient outcomes. If the claim of free market economics is it allocates capital and it allocates time and resources efficiently, does it always do that? And the answer is no, there are failures that happen in the free market. What might be one example of failure? If there isn't enough information available of what is being traded, of what is being bought and sold, then the price doesn't reflect exactly the risk. The price doesn't reflect, what the settlement price should be, right? So information asymmetry is a flaw in the free market, right? Now, a hardcore free marketeer will say, so let's take drugs. So now when a drug is put on the market, imagine if the drug vendor didn't have to indicate the side effects. Imagine if the drug vendor didn't even have to get their drug regulated. Anybody and their brother could put up a drug saying this is a COVID relief drug, right? Or this cures COVID. Let's say you could do that. A true free marketeer will say, you know what, that's okay, because the market will figure it out over time. Over time, it will become apparent which ones work and which ones don't work. And therefore, the ones that work, people will get to know. That's the one that will get successful. That's the one that will get adopted. However, if you think about it, to get to that point probably involves hundreds of thousands of people dying because they took the wrong drug, right? So in this particular case, while the free market might eventually solve the problem of not having enough information, it is at too much of a human cost, right? You would not accept that particular solution. So in that case, it makes sense for a government or regulation to step in and basically force the drug manufacturers to prove their claims, to display the information and so on, right? So the free market often needs government interventions, right, in order to sort of fix these kinds of flaws in the free market, like lack of information. Another kind of flaw that happens is what's called an externality, which means, you might be producing something and pricing it, but let's say in the course of producing it, you're causing a lot of pollution. Who's going to go fix that particular pollution, right? Unless there is a cost associated to you for creating that pollution. And so carbon credits, for example, is a free market mechanism, supposedly, right, of trying to figure out how you might basically figure out the level of pollution each person is doing. And then you have these exchanges where people can buy and sell these carbon credits. So if I'm a company that's polluting a lot, I get some negative points, but then if somebody else is willing to basically assume those because they're doing lots of good things, right? So it becomes a tradable, a tradable instrument in order to actually capture the actual cost of doing something, the pollution costs and the externality costs and so on. But that requires regulation as well. Property rights, right? So something that I was reading a fascinating example in this book I'll highly recommend to your guys called Mine, M-I-N-E with an exclamation mark. It's a book by two lawyers. It's a fascinating book on property rights. So you tend to think of property rights as being obvious, right? You own something or you don't own something. And this book is full of these wonderful examples of what is called property ambiguity, meaning you don't really know. So for example, you walk into an airline, you sit down in a seat, right? And already the seats are all really close to each other. You've opened up your laptop, you're trying to work, and you're barely able to fit in because, all the airlines have put the seats quite close together. And the guy in the seat in front of you leans back, and now you can't use your stuff. Well, who owns that space? Is it the guy in the front who has a button that allows him to, recline? Or is it you because you were there first and you own that particular space before the darn thing disappeared, right? Now, the airline doesn't specify it. Now, why does the airline not specify who owns it? Because it is in their interest to have you figure it out with the guy, right? Why do they want to get into the business of trying to specify who owns the seat and who owns that particular thing? So ownership itself is never cut and dried and never clear, right? So even something as obvious as ownership basically requires interpretation, or a willingness to live with ambiguity as you go forward. So these are all examples of the free market that I'm a fan of, but I recognize that it fails in many, many situations. And typically you need some form of regulation, government intervention and all to do that, right? And so when it is perfectly reasonable for the government to put these burdens on the companies, right, to put a certain percentage aside for a CSR fund, or to basically insist that certain things be regulated, and the free marketeers who whine and cry about it have to grow up, because the free market by itself is not a perfect being, right? All you're trying to do is fix flaws. The problem is sometimes when you try to fix a flaw, you can make it worse. So an example might be, let's say minimum wages, right? And this is a very political issue. Supposing the free market is basically resulting in someone getting paid peanuts because there are thousands of people willing to do that job. Do you just let the free market decide the cost of labor? Or, do we owe something called a minimum wage, right? In which case it's a regulation that there has to be a minimum wage. Now, one would argue on one side that the minimum wage distorts the price signal, meaning it puts a wrong value on a particular activity. And therefore, it basically messes up the demand supply balance, that would have normally happened, has now been forced by some external agency that the clearing price for the demand supply curve in economics is at a different point than where it would have been otherwise, right? This kind of stuff causes inefficiency in the system. Now, there are other ways of dealing with it as well. Now, this is where I'm saying that the free markets, even if there is information symmetry, meaning that problem is solved, externalities are taken care of, property rights are clear, it can still produce outcomes that don't make you feel good as a human being. You look at it and say, what, this is just not right. This is not fair. This is not just, right? And this is where the concept of social justice and morality comes in, saying, you don't want to mess with the free market too much because it makes it inefficient, but you want to mess with it to make it efficient, like I said, with information sharing and so on. But what if the outcome is just not right? What do you do in that particular situation? So, but even there, I think, there are careful ways of doing it. You may have heard of the concept called universal basic income. And the idea of a universal basic income is everybody, any citizen, gets a minimum price, a minimum payment from the government that allows them to live. But in that world, there is no minimum wage, right? Then you let the market run. What you've provided is you've provided money to people to buy, but you have not changed the price signal. So you have not changed basically the pricing. What you've made it is you've made it accessible to more number of people. It also means that if everybody had basic income, you would not have beggars at the road intersection asking for money, right? So there are other kind of costs that go away with the notion of a universal basic income, right? And again, there are lots of arguments against it as well. But that's an argument for where your morality sort of gets, has you try to make an intervention happen. So the key here is whose morality is it, right? Who gets to decide, and how do you know that you're coming up with a good judgment, that is socially appropriate, but that is not messing up the free market, or is messing it up to the least amount possible. And this is where the whole world of ethics comes in, right? I mean, do you look at morality in terms of the end justifies the means, in which case it's okay to do anything as long as the end goal is good? Or do you basically say, what, morality should be viewed in a different manner, right? It must be viewed as anything I do, if somebody else did that, how would the outcomes be? So these are sort of the discussions. Now, coming back to your audience, now, how does this apply in your day-to-day life? I would say in your day-to-day life, if you look at these two concepts of sort of the free market and then social justice, in the free market, as you work in a company or you work with a company, you be sensitive to whether that company is trying to distort the free market, meaning, is there information asymmetry? If so, it should be brought to people's attention, right, within the company. Let's take a look at Facebook and the mess that they've created in this world, right, with fake news and stuff. Facebook has what are called externalities, which is another of the failures, right? The externality of spreading false information is extremely high. And nobody calculated it. Nobody, when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, I don't know if everybody knows, but it was started as a way for Harvard University undergraduate boys to rate how hot or not they found their classmates, their girl classmates, right? That was basically the basis of Facebook. Hot or not was kind of what it was called, right? And from there it became, all the elite Ivy League colleges, basically it became a way for them to get to know each other, and then it became the platform we did. And you could argue that all the negative externality, that platform would be used for fake news, that fake news would result in an assault on democracy and free speech, et cetera, et cetera. You wouldn't have thought of that, right? But if you are a person that is at Tech Mahindra or elsewhere, think about always the seen and the unseen consequences of what decisions you're making, right? And this was an unseen consequence, right? The externality, the negative externality of fake news was not one that was basically factored in, by the Facebook founders. I'll give them the benefit of doubt, right? There was probably nothing they anticipated. But having figured that out, then sort of mercilessly exploiting a user and just throwing more and more targeted content at them, that doesn't feel quite right, right? And I would basically say, even within the free economics or the free market world, you could, if you were working at Facebook or you're working at another company, I'm not saying you need to be a whistleblower all the time, but even if you're working on a system as a solution, think about the fact as to whether it is hiding information or is it fair in its exposition of information. Are there other costs that are being hidden and swept under the rug, right? So these failures of the market system, of the free markets, can be addressed by designers of products, can be addressed by designers of solutions, if they're mindful of the fact that construct number one is, are you making sure the free market can work as efficiently as possible? And the products that you have within the free market are participating in that free market in a fair manner, right? As opposed to something that advantages one group over another group because only one group has information, the other group doesn't, and so on and so forth. And then there is so therein, I think just in your day-to-day professional life, if you basically watch out for these, I think that is a good way to make sure that the free market is not being compromised. The second approach is social justice, which is, are the outcomes such that are still just not right? And if so, how should you as an individual view a situation as opposed to letting the free market decide everything, right? So we have a market economy. We should not have a market society. And Professor Sandel at Harvard University makes that particular point. You don't want your society to be driven entirely based on what the free market dictates. There is this notion of morality or social justice that has to be layered in. And there is this wonderful scholar named John Rawls who basically talks about this concept of the veil of thin ignorance, or a thin veil of ignorance. What it means is, if you, KG, were trying to make a decision, right? Now, and supposing you didn't know who you were, you didn't know who your capabilities were, you didn't know which family you'd been born into, you didn't know what your education was, you don't know who your friends are. What decision would you make? Because the decision you would make is, you would sort of say, look, in a scale of 1 to 100, right? Not everybody is born with the same skills. Not everybody is born with the same family background. And it is unfair to say, listen, the free market makes sure anybody can succeed. True, but not everybody is born with the exact same talent set, right? So how do you account for that? Supposing I told you in that group of 1 to 100 kg, you don't know who you are. Maybe you're the dumbest guy, maybe you're the smartest guy. Maybe you have lost use of your limbs, or maybe you're the world's fastest person. You just don't know. That's what is called the thin veil of ignorance, right? You don't know who you are. Then I tell you, now decide that there is this pool of money and it needs to be divided, and you can decide the fastest people will get the top 90%. So the 10% of the people who are the fastest, racers in the world will share 90% of the pie. The slowest 90% of the people will share the remaining 10% of the pie. KG, are you okay with that? Now, if you were one of the fastest guys, you'd say, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good deal. But supposing you didn't know, maybe you're the fastest guy, maybe you're the slowest guy, right? Now the decision making you would apply is very different, because you don't know who you are. See, you don't want to end up in a situation where you are basically scrapping for pieces as part of the 90%, because who knows, maybe you're in that group, right? And so therefore, you will basically come up with a system that's far more equitable. You will still say that the winners should get more than the losers, right? That's fair. but it can't be that different, right? The equality spread would be actually a lot tighter as opposed to being extremely broad, because you don't know where you might end up personally. See, so there are all these wonderful ways of looking at the world to figure out what makes a just decision, what makes a good decision. So anyway, so those are the two concepts I'll leave behind. I know I went off on a very professorial high horse here.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you. I think you see the underlying, you are cerebral, right? You are rancho, and there are not too many ranchos, right? Ranchos are few. So for the common Aam Aadmi, so to speak, uh, I don't know how they will. I think that will be a challenge as you create your MBAs. I mean, MBAs will from SPJN will likely be more closer to Rancho is my assumption. Uh, how do you kind of infuse this thought of conscious capitalism into them?
Yeah, so I think the key thing, KG, would be, first of all, I would say never take, the existing world and information and status quo as a given, right? Always try and understand, well, why? When the thing when we are kids, or if you remember from when when you had little children, they'll ask you why, right? No matter what you say, the next question from that 3-year-old is why, right? Why till finally maybe they get tired and they don't ask you why anymore, right? But this whole notion of asking why multiple times is a good thing, right? Or do you really know this for a fact? And I'll tell you, I've given up on a lot of the older generation, KG, and I'll sit with my relatives and stuff, and I'm saying, I don't have the energy to try and change these people's minds. And it's not like I'm trying to change their minds to my point of view. I'm trying to get them to understand that whatever they're saying is based on a set of biases, is based on wrong assumptions, is based on unscientific information, but in their mind, it's all like crystal clear, right? But if you ask, why do you say that? Why do you believe it? What is your evidence? Even that would deconstruct. So if you're not a rancho, I think if you basically always look for evidence, right? If you sort of say, if there is a claim, what is the evidence behind that claim, right? And until you basically see the evidence that, and we all know that evidence is not 100%. It's not black and white, right? If anything, COVID taught us that evidence basically comes with confidence intervals. This drug is likely to work 80% of the time, right? We all would want the vaccines to be 100% effective, but they're not. But yet, you would still take them because, 70% is better than 0%, right? But the notion that any claim is not an absolute claim, right, but has a confidence interval associated with it and is probabilistic, I think are the key parts, right? So I would say if you're a non-rancho, look for the evidence, right? And basically understand that we live in a very probabilistic world, meaning that even that piece of evidence, always ask for what is the probability that that evidence is true. So I'd say if you do that, then you don't take the world as given to you, right? I mean, you basically try and understand the world as it exists. Now, then within that, sort of saying, listen, is the world this way because some people have information and some people don't? And that's kind of the essence of free markets to some extent, right? And then to sort of say, okay, the world is this way. Does it feel right, right? And under what assumption do I feel this feels right or not? And if you basically, again, and it'll depend on your cultural context. You and I, KG, might look at a situation, involving women's rights, and we might conclude one thing in one manner. A group in some other part of the world that maybe has historically not been very woman friendly might basically look at the exact same situation with a whole different lens, right? So I'm not saying that just because you ask why that your final moral solution will be the same. But basically recognizing that, looking for the fairness of a solution, I think, and sort of saying, is my viewpoint the only viewpoint or not, is, I think, the thing to do. And I think what we lose today is the ability to have that kind of an open mind, right, that takes in not just random information, but information that you test, right, for evidence, right? So be open-minded, but be critical, right? Hold yourself up to a high standard where you're open-minded, but when the information comes in, don't take it as a given, challenge it, understand the evidence behind it, the probabilities behind it. Then you can apply your moral judgment, whatever your moral code might be, but recognize there are other people with probably other kinds of moral codes, right? And you can't always say who's right, who's wrong. And I'll give you a very good example of moral code. So this is a really great story, KG. So there is this whole set of philosophers' problems involving this, it's called the trolley problem, the trolley and the fat man problem. So here's the problem. So you're standing on a bridge and you see a train coming down the track, and you have basically the ability to send the train on one spur or a different spur, right? So you can do the shunting to send the train down one track or the other track. You see, sitting from your position on the bridge, that there are 10 school children on one spur. And on another spur, there is one person. The train is coming down the track towards the 10 children. You have the ability to change the track and have it go and kill the one person instead. What would you do? Would you change the track? Some people will say, sure, the only thing that matters is basically, net lives. I'll take the one guy out, right? I'll save the 10 children. So that's one argument. Another argument would be, you don't know who that one guy is. What if he's the one guy who's going to solve the world's problems tomorrow, and those 10 children are going to grow up to be thugs and hooligans who end up in jail, right? Would you still make that decision? Well, you don't know at that point, right? So, but then, and it turns out that men will actually be far more comfortable changing the shunt and the track to kill the one guy as opposed to killing the 10 kids. Women will basically say, I'm not sure it's my business to do it, right? So they'll let the train, not all of them, but a greater number of women will let the train through on its original path, right? Because they sort of say it's not our business. So even there, between men and women, in the exact same situation, you see different stories. And, who's to say what is right, what is wrong? And then there is the fat man problem that's added to it, which is you're standing on the bridge. There is a group of 10 children. There's the trains coming down, but there's a fat guy standing next to you, right? Now, you could push the fat guy over the bridge onto the track, onto the oncoming path of the train. And by doing so, the fat guy will get killed by the train, but the 10 children will be saved. Would you actively push the fat guy off the bridge? Now, the outcome is exactly the same, right? It's really the same problem as the first problem, right? You're talking about one life versus 10 lives. Here, you're supposed to be pushing the guy over. There, it was much more you're pulling a shunt lever, right? And more people are hesitant to push this fat guy over because that doesn't feel right. Whereas, pushing a button to change the track, that seemed a little bit better. So my only point is, and it's the exact same situation. And different people will the same person will interpret the situation differently depending on how it's worded to them. Or two people might interpret the same situation worded exactly the same way differently, like the men and women situation, right? So my point simply is that moral code isn't absolute, right? Everyone's trying to do the right thing. Everyone's trying to be moral, but you can end up with totally different answers depending on your frame. And who's to say which is right, which is wrong? All you can do is recognize that there are multiple possible outcomes, and at least be thoughtful about what those outcomes might be, right? So be open-minded, take information in, challenge information, right? Make sure that there is evidence, use probabilistic thinking, and recognize that any decision you make, there are probably equally valid counter-arguments to your decision from a morality point of view. So be humble about it. Don't claim, I am the sole giver of truth. I don't really like anybody who takes a very absolute view that they know all the answers, because you just can't. So anyway, so that would be for the non-ranchos.
Super. I think there's one question, I don't know how relevant. What if that one man is a superhero and he can save himself as well as the 10 children?
Hey, listen, whoever asked the question, I'm assuming you're closer in age to my 19-year-old boy and my 24-year-old daughter. And I watched every superhero and every Marvel movie with them, since the beginning of time. You're right about that. If you knew it was Iron Man, maybe Iron Man wants to get pushed down there because then he can take care of the whole business himself. But my point simply is you really don't know. So you have to always operate, in a world of, ignorance or incomplete information, right? And it's best to be modest about, how confident you are, right? It just bothers me when people are too confident about situations when you can point to 10 reasons why that answer could be wrong.
I think we'll do one last question. We are top of the hour, and it is to do. I went through your LinkedIn profile and saw that barring your HP and later on your visiting faculty, you've kind of 2 years, 3 years, you've moved on. I mean, correct. So and in today's world, kids, I'm of different that GE, Tata, Godrej, vintage. So my question, for the sake of the others, is which is the better one? Move on, stay on.
So I think it is a question of two things, right? One, So let's say you always have two options ahead of you, right? The one you're currently in and something else, right? So I think a reasonable way to look at it is to say, where can you contribute more, right? So I wouldn't say, what is better for you per se. I'll come to that in a second. I would begin by saying, where can you contribute more? Because we as human beings have a finite amount of time to hopefully contribute our, talent and our skills to making the world a better place, right? Ideally. And if there are two opportunities, one might just be a better fit for you at that moment in time than the other one. And if that place which you feel you can contribute more is outside your current job, well, that is what it is. So I think the second thing, to also, besides sort of saying where would I contribute more, might be to sort of look at these other factors. Where can I learn more, right? So I think that's an extremely important thing for today's folks. So maybe you can contribute more in some place, but maybe you really won't learn anything new. Maybe it's just going to use what you have done for the last 5 years. That's why you can contribute more. But really, you also want to learn more. Maybe you can learn more in your current environment, right? So that's an equally valid point. So where can I contribute more? Where can I learn more? And third, I would basically put down, what in our generation, would have been maybe the number one issue about, loyalty, if you will, right? What do I owe to my friends and colleagues and coworkers? And I'd say that's important, but I would put it down as number three, because if you're looking to, maximize, do a global maxima, if you remember your calculus days, there's a notion of a local maxima and a global maxima, right? If you're looking to basically do a global maxima, I think that is a better way than doing a local maxima, right? And if the global maxima comes about because you find a new opportunity where you can contribute more, where you can learn more, and the local maxima you give up is the company you currently are in, right? So yes, you are letting your friends and colleagues down, but it's against the global maxima that you're pursuing. And I'm not saying it always works out that way, right? Sometimes people go into new positions, I think, for the wrong reasons. I have never once, I'll tell you, KG, I have never once in my life, I'm 56 years old, never once in my life have I changed a job for higher pay. Never once have I ever asked about CTC. Never once have I moved a job because I got paid more. It has always been on these other issues, right? And I think that's a good way to look at it, because eventually it lands you in a place that you're happy with, versus trying to sort of fine tune and get, how do I get 20% more here? Or you wait till January, you get your increment in your current company. Then you go look for, I know how the games work. I had Indian employees as well in my previous company, right? I'm not a big fan of that, because over time, I don't think that's a very, good approach to managing your life and career.
Fantastic. Great conversation. Thank you very much, Varun, for coming over. We are at the top of the hour, 2 minutes over. We, tried to fit it in the right time. So I think there are more questions I have, but, another time.
Okay, KG. I know it didn't quite, you intimidated me by saying Vidya Balan was on and Monty Panesar was on. I'm going, okay, after those kinds of names, my professorial stuff is, it's different. But anyway, hopefully it was useful.
Within Kannada says great conversations. Thank you. What is that? You said global something and local. I always
global maxima and local maxima. And the counter is global minima and local minima for those of your employees who remember that.
It tells me that if I write my 12th standard exam, I will not get more than 10 marks. So, and you will, definitely get 60 plus. Super conversations, great insight, great learnings, Mayank Shah. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate your audience for listening in and humoring me. Thank you so much. Have a great day.